Hello and welcome to the Print Ion China column. So, if you haven't been paying attention to China's EV industry and the numbers lately, you need to be paying attention to that. So, right now in China, every second new car sold is electric, and it's not hybrid, it's purely electric, a full new energy vehicle. And 1 in 10 cars already driving around on Chinese road is running on electric power. And according to Chinese analysts, this is only the beginning of the transformation of Chinese EV sector. So, what is driving this extraordinary growth? Why are Chinese EVs expanding so rapidly overseas? And how is China itself framing this success? Let's take a closer look at that. So, the numbers coming out of China are very difficult to ignore. Official data for 2025 show record production and record sales of new energy vehicles. And for the very first time, more than half of all new cars sold in China were new energy vehicles, marking a major milestone in the country's transition away from conventional petrol and diesel cars to making country a true green energy proponent. So exports also reached new heights, doubling compared with the previous year, and the momentum has now continued into this year as well. So Chinese sources report that EV exports increased by 77% in the first quarter of this year alone, which is a huge number, which is a huge increase. And Chinese media have celebrated each of these milestones. They are presenting and amplifying them as evidence of China's technological capabilities and industrial competitiveness. But these are headlines. Beyond the headlines, the growth is also demonstrating something much deeper than strong consumer demand. For Beijing, electric vehicles have become a strategic industry. Chinese analysts now argue that this success is built on two structural advantages. The first is China's complete industrial ecosystem. And what they're saying is that, unlike many countries, China has developed almost the entire EV supply chain domestically, from battery production and raw material processing to vehicle assembly and software development. Everything has happened at the domestic level without much imports and without much technology from the outside country. And having these industries clustered together allows companies to innovate more quickly and reduce production cost. Then the second advantage, according to Chinese analysis, is the country's enormous domestic market. Of course, now it is the second largest populous country in the world. China has been a major big market for a number of economies, and with millions of consumers buying EVs every year, manufacturers have the skill to experiment with different technologies, price points, as well as business models. And this is what happened in Chinese EV sector as well. So competition between dozens of domestic brands have also accelerated innovation, have also advanced the technology that is being used in the Chinese EV sector. And according to Wang Chen, who works for the Development Research Center of the State Council of the People's Republic of China, this combination of industrial capacity and market size is something very few countries can replicate. Then another economist who also works for the government, Lin Chao, uh, he argued that even the new energy vehicles were responsible for over 100% of the growth in China's automobile exports in 2025. So, in fact, what it implies is that without EVs and without the advancement in the EV sector, it might be a probability that China's overall auto export growth would actually have declined. So that underlines just how central this industry has become to China's economic strategy. Then, another interesting feature of China's EV industry is how quickly new opportunities are emerging. Perhaps the best example here is that of Xiaomi. Of course, Xiaomi is known for its phone and low-cost phone from China, and but in the EV sector, only a few years ago, Xiaomi was known for producing EVs as well, and not just the smart. It is not just regarded as a smartphone company from China. So today, its vehicles, including the SU7 Ultra and the newly launched YU7, are being compared with premium brands such as BMW, Tesla, Mercedes Benz, and Audi. In fact, when you compare If you look at the Chinese discourse, there's hardly any comparison with Tesla. They're actually comparing Chinese EVs with high-end um, brands such as Mercedes and BMW. So we could actually kind of see how they view the EV sector, how they view the EV cars in China. So Chinese social media users describe this as a evidence of China's rapid innovation. Increasingly, Chinese commentators argue that their companies are beginning to influence these standards that will shape the future of the global automotive industry. And whether they prove true in the long term, I think it remains to be seen. But in the contemporary time, in the current scenario, it does reflect a growing confidence within China. And that confidence is also reflected in overseas markets. For example, in Europe, Chinese new EVs, they are being sold uh, at a very rapid pace, according to the Chinese discourse and the data that is coming out of China. So in Europe, the sales reportedly increased by 179% in early 2026, and market share doubled to around 8%. And we have to keep in mind that in Europe, there were a number of companies that produce high-end EV. So penetrating into that market is something that they claim the Chinese have been able to do. So while electric vehicles in the market accounted for almost 31% of new car sales, um, the Chinese market is really able to get into the European countries and and in fact providing a competitive edge to the countries that have been dominating the European markets for a number of decades. So brands such as BYD have played an important role by offering competitively priced vehicles. So this is how the Chinese EV story in European markets is being projected. But then, if we look closer in the Southeast Asian region, it tells an even more striking story about how Chinese EV sector industry is being talked about and is doing in that region. So countries such as Thailand and Indonesia recorded rapid growth in EV demand, and Chinese manufacturers now account for over 86% of the regional market. And in Thailand, the Chinese analysis commentary suggests that Chinese brands have overtaken Japanese automakers, which had dominated the country's automotive market for decades. So Chinese media also point to growing sales in the Middle East, Latin America, and Oceania as further evidence that Chinese EVs are becoming increasingly competitive internationally. But expansion is not really happening without resistance. Of course, we have known about this trade dispute between European Union and China, specifically with respect to the EVs, and that EU now has introduced tariffs on Chinese EVs, arguing that Chinese manufacturers benefit from unfair state subsidies. But Chinese commentary presents a very different interpretation of what's actually happening. So, very recently, or just earlier this week, Chinese Commerce Minister Wang Wentao visited Brussels to talk about trade issues, trade concerns in Brussels. So, Chinese media actually described the dispute, the tariff, as an attempt to slow what they are calling as the westward expansion of Chinese EV industry. And some commentators even argue that the tariffs ultimately hurt both sides. It's just not going to be harming the Chinese industry, but also the European consumers would face higher prices and potentially slower adoption of EVs. While in terms of what impact it is going to have on the Chinese uh, EV sector, is that Chinese manufacturers must decide whether to absorb the additional cost or pass them on to customers. So this is going to be a dilemma for the Chinese EV manufacturers as well. So, from China's perspective, this becomes evidence that protectionism benefits no one, and it is going to be a loss scenario for both EU as well as for China. Then, one aspect of Chinese commentary on the EV sector that has caught my attention is how it discusses India. So, rather than portraying India as a major competitive in the sector, Chinese analysts present it as a cautionary example. Although India's EV market is growing, there is humongous demand for EV vehicles now. So Chinese sources note that more than 90% of the battery cells that are used in the Indian manufactured electric vehicles are actually imported and imported from China. In fact, much of it is imported from China. So China, by contrast, dominates many of the most valuable parts of the supply chain, from lithium ion battery cells to core manufacturing technology. And assembling electric vehicles is only a part of the equation. So controlling the battery supply chain is where the real advantage lies, and this is where China believes it currently holds a commanding position. And apart from that, there is also challenges that are being discussed. So Chinese researchers are not really ignoring the challenges entirely, and they identify three main risks to continued overseas expansion. The first is growing geopolitical tensions and protectionist policies, particularly in the US and Europe. Then, second is increasingly complex regulations, including new European carbon and battery requirements. Then, the third is competition among Chinese companies themselves as well. So, as more Chinese manufacturers enter overseas markets, intense price competition could damage profitability and reinforce the perception that Chinese brands compete primarily on raw prices rather than quality and innovation. So, the entire narrative that Chinese produce cheap quality product might come back to the forefront if they do not really focus on quality and innovation and just keep focusing on the profitability and maintaining the low prices. So, what does all of this tell us? In my opinion, for China, this isn't just about a commercial issue. This isn't just about selling cars and this one particular sector becoming a topic or a subject for Chinese economy and advancement in Chinese economy. In my view, and what I have noticed after looking at the discourse, is that the EV industry in China is now becoming a symbol of technological ambition, industrial upgrading, as well as energy security and green development. What I've seen is that it shows a much broader goal within the Chinese scheme of things, and that is reshaping China's global image. For decades, China has been viewed as the world's factory for low cost goods. But today, the Chinese discourse presents a very different narrative, maybe from the low cost, low quality manufacturer of the world. Now, country China is trying to catch up with established automotive powers, and it wants to become a country where even high end product could be established and could be sold to the world. So the narrative that is coming out of China in terms of EV, it is actually helping China define the future of the global car industry. So to conclude, I would say that whether that ambition succeeds will depend on a number of factors, including trade tensions, technological competition, geopolitical developments. But one thing, as of now, I think it's very important to emphasize that China's EV revolution is just not a domestic story anymore. It is actually being talked about in a number of countries. A number of countries are actually seeing the practical aspect of it as well. So it's absolutely becoming a global story, and it is reshaping the future of the automotive industry. At least this is a narrative that is coming out of China, and that is aligned with the data that is also coming out of China. So I think this is just not about how this is just one sector of Chinese economy, but how it is able to make China a global stakeholder, from the manufacturing hub of the world of low quality chip to the manufacturer of high quality product is something that we have to keep paying attention to, specifically from India, which could actually be an effective competitor to China in the long run in the EV sector. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week.